After 17 years of loyalty, all I got was a cold clean out your desk. But they had no idea what I knew. My name is Greg Sanders, and for nearly 2 decades, I was the quiet force behind the IT systems at HelixCore Technologies in Columbus, Ohio. I trained every new hire, fixed every crisis, and built an infrastructure that carried the company from dial-up days into the cloud era. So when my boss, Mr. Langford, called me in with HR beside him and delivered the news, "Your role is eliminated, effective immediately," I didn't argue. I just nodded, packed my things, and left without a word. But what they didn't realize was that I had built more than just systems. I had built layers of protection, audit trails, and secured off-site backups, all with board-approved protocols. And during the last few months, while I was being pushed out of projects, I had quietly uncovered a pattern: inflated payments to a fake vendor, Apex Integration Group, tied to our own CFO's family. It was subtle, buried beneath legitimate transactions, but unmistakably fraudulent. They thought they were erasing me. But what they'd really done was remove the one person who could keep the truth buried. And by Friday, that truth would blow the doors off everything they'd tried to hide. Because I don't burn bridges. I let them collapse under the weight of their own corruption. "You're being let go." That was the entire explanation Greg Sanders got after 17 years of loyal service at HelixCore Technologies in Columbus, Ohio. No warning, no gratitude, just a stiff handshake and a rushed exit. But what his boss and HR didn't realize was that firing Greg wasn't a clean break. It was the trigger that set off a chain reaction none of them were prepared for. Greg had been the backbone of HelixCore's IT systems from its startup days in a 2-story office to its current 12-floor high rise. He built networks, trained entire departments, and stayed through 3 CEOs. But when a new VP of Operations, Daniel Langford, came in with his buzzword, heavy playbook, streamlining, digital transformation, future-proofing, Greg noticed the shift. He wasn't invited to meetings anymore. His access permissions quietly changed. They were pushing him out. He saw it. And instead of resisting, he observed and documented. That's when he found it. While running routine back-end security protocols, a task no one else even remembered existed, Greg spotted repeated payments to a vendor called Apex Integration Group. At first glance, nothing seemed off, but Greg's attention to detail was unmatched. The payment patterns didn't align with any actual IT purchases. A deeper dive revealed something stunning. Apex was registered to a UPS mailbox, and the listed owner, Thomas Wilcox, the CFO's brother-in-law. Over 18 months, HelixCore had been funneling inflated IT costs through this shell vendor, quietly draining company funds. Greg kept digging. He found forged signatures, altered approval chains, and strategic departmental changes, all timed perfectly with the creation of Apex. Worse yet, it was clear Daniel Langford had helped facilitate the scheme by removing obstacles, like Greg. After his firing, Greg retreated to his home office, plugged in one of several legally maintained off-site backups, and began compiling a report. He wasn't angry. He was surgical. He created a timeline, connected the names, identified the patterns, and verified every single figure. By the time he was done, he had a case more airtight than any security system he'd ever built. Greg didn't go to the press. He didn't go to HR. He went directly to a board member he trusted, Robert Chen, a former partner during HelixCore's early cybersecurity reforms. He handed over the report data, timelines, proof of fraud totaling over $4.5 million. He wasn't looking for a job back. He just wanted the truth to be seen. Within days, HelixCore erupted. Emergency board meetings, executives scrambling, police arriving. Greg watched quietly as the very men who tried to erase him, Daniel Langford, CFO Brian Wilcox, and their golden boy consultant Jason Phillips, were placed on administrative leave and eventually charged with conspiracy and fraud. Weeks later, Greg received a call. The board wasn't just asking him to return. They were offering him a brand new role, Chief Information Security Officer, with direct reporting to the board and full audit control across departments. Greg accepted, but on one condition: complete authority to stop this from ever happening again. Now, in his new corner office, Greg reflects not with bitterness, but with clarity. The betrayal hurt, but it exposed a deeper rot, and in responding with precision, not rage, He didn't just reclaim his career, he rewrote the company's future. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they assumed was disposable. They thought firing Greg was a clean break. What they didn't realize was that the man they had just pushed out the door held the master key to their downfall. 3 days after Greg Sanders was terminated without warning from HelixCore Technologies, he sat in his quiet home office, meticulously combing through data files, access logs, and email threads he had quietly archived over the years. What began as a curious anomaly, suspicious vendor payments to a shell company, had grown into a full-blown fraud scheme implicating the company's top brass. But to build a watertight case, Greg knew he needed more than just numbers. He needed a pattern. It didn't take long to find one. Over a span of 3 years, HelixCore's finance department, led by CFO Brian Wilcox, had authorized inflated payments to 2 consulting firms, Apex Integration Group and Lakeside Business Solutions. Both companies had the same setup: fake addresses, no employees, no websites. And both were registered to close family members, Brian's brother-in-law and his wife, respectively. On paper, they looked legitimate: contracts, invoices, service logs. But when Greg Cross referenced them with HelixCore's internal systems, it was clear the services were either overpriced or never delivered at all. Even more alarming was the involvement of Daniel Langford, the same executive who had pushed Greg out. Greg found internal emails showing Daniel had personally lobbied for increased departmental budgets and expedited payments to these vendors. That alone might not have proved guilt, but there was more. One particularly damning email showed Daniel forwarding vendor contract approvals directly to Jason Phillips, the so-called consultant Daniel had brought in 6 months prior. That email bypassed procurement protocols, and its timestamp coincided with when Greg's administrative access was first reduced. They weren't just trying to streamline operations. They were quietly cutting Greg off from the systems he had built, the ones that could expose them. But the final nail was buried deep: a metadata log revealing that Brian Wilcox had manually adjusted approval limits in the company's financial software shortly before the largest Apex transaction. 220 Zeverlod had been processed. That level of manipulation couldn't be explained away as standard operations. Greg compiled everything into a report: timeline charts, screenshots, registration records, access logs, and a detailed explanation of how the scheme had worked. When he handed the sealed folder to board member Robert Chen, Greg said only one thing: "This is not revenge. This is responsibility." The board responded swiftly. Forensic audits were launched. Executives were suspended. Within days, the company's general counsel contacted Greg directly, not to scold or threaten, but to ask for a full debrief. Then came the surprising turn. The board didn't just want Greg's help exposing the fraud. They wanted him to return as Chief Information Security Officer, with executive-level authority to oversee all internal systems, compliance protocols, and future vendor contracts. Greg would report directly to the board, not through any of the existing management. Greg agreed, but only on one condition: complete independence, and the power to rebuild the company's digital and ethical infrastructure from the ground up. By the time the dust settled, 3 executives were facing criminal charges. Over $5.2 million in misappropriated funds had been uncovered, and HelixCore's future was in Greg's hands. And this time, he wasn't just maintaining servers. He was guarding the soul of the company. He was the firewall they never knew they needed. Greg Sanders never sought revenge, but when his silence was mistaken for weakness, he gave them a lesson in quiet justice. It started with a closed-door meeting and a sentence Greg had never imagined hearing after 17 years of loyalty. "We're eliminating your position. Please clear out your desk by the end of the day." Daniel Langford, the executive who'd barely lasted 5 years at HelixCore, didn't offer a handshake or explanation, just the cold efficiency of corporate politics. Greg nodded once, didn't argue, and walked out without a scene. But inside, something had shifted. For almost 2 decades, Greg had been the quiet architect behind the company's systems. The one who stayed through holidays, trained every new hire, and built infrastructure resilient enough to outlast 3 CEOs. While Daniel and his flashy new consultant Jason Phillips were busy preaching, Digital transformation. Greg had been watching and documenting. What they didn't know was that Greg had been quietly collecting data for months. It began with an irregular vendor, Apex Integration Group, receiving consistent payments that didn't match any project timelines. That alone was suspicious. But when Greg Cross checked the registration address, he found it led to a UPS mailbox. Digging deeper, he connected the firm to Thomas Wilcox, the brother-in-law of the company's CFO, Brian Wilcox. The real twist came when Greg matched those payments to inflated software license renewals. A 15% markup here, a 20% bump there. Small enough to avoid detection, but across 18 months, they'd siphoned close to $1.8 million. Greg said nothing. He knew speaking up internally might get buried, or worse, used against him. Instead, he built a meticulous digital dossier, email threads, transaction logs, administrative access histories. Then he waited. When they fired him, he didn't panic. He simply moved to phase 2. From home, Greg began assembling a report. One that didn't just expose Brian and his shell company, but also revealed how Daniel had approved policy changes that gave the CFO unchecked access to financial systems. Even Jason Phillips wasn't clean. His firm had been hired through bypass procurement channels, and Greg traced communications showing his real task was to modernize the department by removing Greg. When the report was complete, Greg handed it to Robert Chen, a longtime board member he trusted. No demands, no threats, just the facts. What followed was a corporate implosion. Executives were suspended. Forensic audits confirmed Greg's findings. The board was stunned not just by the fraud, but by the precision with which Greg had documented everything. They didn't just offer him his old job back. They created a new role for him, Chief Information Security Officer, reporting directly to the board, with oversight across departments. Greg returned to HelixCore not as a technician, but as a watchdog. The man they underestimated had become their final line of defense. He didn't return out of spite. He returned to make sure no one ever mistook quiet competence for irrelevance again, because the most dangerous person in the room is often the one who says nothing, until it's too late. In the boardroom that day, no one expected that the quiet man they just pushed out would be the very person to bring their entire power structure crashing down, silently, methodically. Greg Sanders, age 54, had been the backbone of HelixCore Technologies for 17 years. As a senior systems analyst, he wasn't flashy, didn't make noise. He just kept the company's digital infrastructure humming through CEO changes, software overhauls, and crises most folks never even knew about. When they let him go without a handshake or even a warning, Greg simply nodded, packed up his few personal belongings, and walked out. But inside, something had shifted. Not anger, but clarity. He knew something they didn't, someone at the top was stealing. Greg wasn't the kind of man to ran or raise hell. He was a builder of systems, of trust, of safeguards. So when his access to internal systems started getting mysteriously trimmed and his name disappeared from project meetings, he didn't complain. He paid attention. And what he found was a trail. Small, odd payments to a vendor called Apex Integration Group. The payments kept growing, the vendor's name seemed off, and the kicker, it was registered to Thomas Wilcox, brother-in-law to Brian Wilcox, the company's chief financial officer. As Greg dug deeper, a quiet storm unfolded. Over months, millions had been siphoned through inflated payments, 10 to 20% markups disguised as legitimate vendor fees. And it wasn't just Brian involved. Daniel Prescott, Greg's boss, the one who fired him, had been complicit, manipulating access logs and keeping Greg from seeing what was really going on. But Greg didn't go straight to the press or send a dramatic email. That's not his style. Instead, he quietly handed over a detailed report, dates, figures, digital trails, to Robert Chen, a respected board member who once worked closely with Greg on a major security overhaul. Robert read the report, and the boardroom exploded. Within days, an emergency meeting was called. Brian, Daniel, and outside consultant Jason Phillips were all suspended pending investigation. Greg was asked to return, but he refused the same desk. He had one condition: a new role, Chief Information Security Officer, reporting directly to the board with full authority over all tech-related financial decisions. No bureaucracy. No games. They agreed. Greg returned, not for revenge, to protect the company from ever falling into the same trap. He didn't destroy HelixCore. He saved it. From that day forward, no one saw Greg as just the quiet IT guy in the corner. He was the last man standing when the system collapsed, and the first to rebuild it with justice and integrity. When Greg Sanders stepped into the HelixCore boardroom 6 months after being abruptly fired, the atmosphere had shifted. No longer the overlooked systems analyst tucked away in IT, he was now being offered a seat at the executive table, with a title, a voice, and full authority. The very people who once dismissed him were now leaning on his integrity to steer the company forward. In the months following the exposure of the internal fraud scheme, Greg didn't gloat. He got to work. While former executives faced criminal charges and reputations collapsed, Greg focused on rebuilding the company's internal systems, this time with transparency, fairness, and accountability at the core. He promoted the younger techs who once looked up to him, giving them the guidance and recognition he'd been denied for years. Greg never set out to be a hero. He just refused to be a victim. His quiet strength, his discipline, and his unwavering moral compass were what ultimately saved the company that once discarded him. And now, as he sipped his coffee overlooking the skyline from his new office, he wasn't thinking about revenge. He was thinking about doing it right. Sometimes, the quietest people carry the loudest truths. Life may sideline you, others may underestimate you, but when you stay true to your values, integrity wins. Greg's story reminds us that dignity, preparation, and quiet resilience can change everything. You don't always have to shout to be heard. Sometimes, all it takes is doing what's right, even when no one's watching. Have you ever been underestimated or pushed aside? How did you bounce back? Share your story in the comments below. We'd love to hear it. If stories like this move you, inspire you, or make you reflect, hit the like button and subscribe for more real, life-turning points. Because sometimes, the biggest victories begin in silence.